Howdy, everybody. Today we're picking up with the presidency of Franklin Pierce. So Pierce is going to kind of be the president at the beginning of the 1850s, where we start seeing a lot of the sectional division beginning to develop and laying the foundations for what's going to become the American Civil War. Now, we have to understand about Pierce is while he does have leanings one way or the other, in general he's just trying to be a good president, but pretty much from day one, things go against him. And the very first thing that happens in his presidency kind of turns his whole term sour, kind of puts a black cloud on it. So let's jump right in. So 1852, Pierce gets elected. You see that Free Soil Party running again. So we'll talk a little bit more about the Free Soil Party later. But Pierce wins with a really solid margin. So, fairly solid in the popular vote, but the electoral vote. He wins virtually every state. Was 4 states he doesn't win. So this is a massive landslide in favor of Pierce. The Democrats have taken control of the government in a big way over the Whigs. So here is Franklin Pierce. Now, the thing about Pierce, he tries his hardest to be a good president, but things are going to turn sour for him immediately. On the train ride up to kind of go to DC to become president just shortly after he won the election, his son, himself, and his wife are in a massive train wreck. And it's bad. He and his wife manage to survive, but his son dies. Think about this. You just win probably the biggest election of your life. You become president of the United States, and within weeks, your son dies. So you're trying to go in and be a good president, but you kind of have this tainted emotional state with you through your first few years of presidency. So not exactly a resounding start. So you kind of see different pictures here of the train wreck that Pierce survived, but his son did not. Now, you see this happening more and more. Every president is trying to do some form of civil service reform. Pretty much since Jackson on, you have some effort at reforming civil service to do away with that spoil system that Jackson kind of exemplified and create a more merit-based government, a government that actually hires skilled people rather than just your friends and buddies to do jobs. So you have this continuing effort. We'll see this civil service reform now. We'll see this all the way up until late 1900s. So this is a long-term project, and every president's trying to do their little step to promote civil service reform. Jefferson Davis is going to be crucial to this. So Jefferson Davis is the Secretary of War for Pierce. Now you might also know Jefferson Davis as the President of the Confederacy. Well, for now, he's just the Secretary of War for the United States. And he has his own plans and his own ideas that he's trying to implement within the United States. And they're surprisingly innovative in many ways. Not anything near what he's going to try to do once we get to the Civil War, but nonetheless, these are interesting. So one of the first things he's going to try to do, if I can get my slide to change, is military land surveys. He's using the U.S. Army as a tool to go out west, survey the land, figure out what's out there, start plotting out land surveys so that people can start moving out west. So the military is kind of this vanguard going out first to help settle the West, kind of figure out what's out there, how to break it up, how to sell it, how to give it away, whatever it might be. Now, traveling out in the far west, you're basically dealing with the desert in many ways. So in order to transport supplies to many of these far-flung outposts, Jefferson Davis is going to introduce the U.S. Army Camel Corps. He's like, camels work well in deserts. We have basically a desert out west, so let's use some camels. So he buys 20 or 30 camels from overseas, brings them to the United States, and creates the Camel Corps. Now, most soldiers hated the ideas of camels. They liked horses, hated camels. But the problem was the camels did a really good job. They were very good at going long distances with minimal water and harsh conditions. Now, not everyone got along with the camels. They didn't know how to use the camels. Camels have a tendency to spit at you whenever they're pissed off at you, so it just didn't go well. And by the time we hit the Civil War, any idea in the U.S. Army that's attached to Jefferson Davis is going to get killed. Not because it's a bad idea. The camels were a good idea for what they were being used for, But because it was attached to Jefferson Davis, the president of the enemy country, of the enemy force, it gets scrapped. They sell off some of them to some of the camels to circuses. They just let some go in the middle of the desert. Now, there's no wild camel herds today, but nonetheless, they just let some of them go, live out their lives, so on and so forth. But the Camel Corps ultimately dies. It starts during Pierce's term and dies just a few short years later. Then this pushes us to this growing sectional division. Time and time again, we see more and more things beginning to divide the nation. So you have a reaction to the fugitive slave law of the Compromise of 1850. A lot of Northerners in particular hated the idea of having to participate in the retrieval of runaway slaves. They saw this as, impediment of their own individual freedoms. They didn't want to participate with slavery, and now this law was forcing them at times to help identify runaway slaves. Then you have literature coming out that's going to change things. One of the biggest is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Coming out during Pierce's term, it's going to raise sectional tension between North and South. It's introducing Northerners for the first time to kind of the visible horrors of slavery. A lot of people understood, yeah, slavery's bad, abstractly, we kind of get that, but when you read about it, and it's almost worse than a movie in many ways because people's imaginations, you describe something, and their imaginations make it look and feel a lot worse than it probably actually is. But in this case, it's showing slavery in its truest light. So this is a very interesting book, and it's going to kind of illustrate to many Northerners and kind of codify this idea that slavery is in fact bad and maybe in fact should end at some point. Then you have another book coming out that today has been made a movie. And it's going to have huge impact, particularly the movie today. And I highly recommend, if you haven't seen it, it's one of the recommended movies for the class. Watch it. It gives you a good idea of what slavery was like just before the Civil War, that kind of harshest, most brutal form of U.S. slavery that we tend to think of when we think of American slavery. So this is an interesting story. It was a free man, free black man in the North, actually gets kidnapped and sold into slavery despite being free. This shows some of the problems with the fugitive slave law. So I highly recommend watching the movie, but this is adding another layer of problem onto, like, another log on the fire of distrust between North and South. So that's coming out in 1853. 1854, more stuff goes wrong for Pierce. So we're only 2 years into his presidency and things are starting to bubble up in big ways. So Pierce thinks, I should try to find some way to unite the nation. So he says, we need to build a continental railroad, transcontinental railroad, sorry. So he wants to build a railroad across from the east to the west and connect the nation. Problem is, going across the Great Plains, pretty easy. Then when you get a little further west, you hit the Rocky Mountains. So he looks up north into Canada, all Rocky Mountains. Looks further south towards the Mexican territory, that little yellow area called the Gadsden Purchase. He realizes it's lower, less mountainous, less hilly. You can get a railroad through there quicker. So he arranges to purchase this land from Mexico. Now, by default, this would make the railroad run more focused through the south. And this is what freaked people out. Not that we wanted to build a transcontinental railroad, but that it was going to flow through the south. Because it was going to go that direction, people were like, oh, this is a Southern conspiracy to give more power to the Southerners. People are going to freak out, they're going to get pissed, and it's going to make Pierce look really, really bad. So you kind of see where the proposed eventual Southern Pacific will end up. That was kind of what Pierce wanted to build, but for now, it's going to get killed. Now, there was that clause in the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo that we talked about in an earlier video that said the U.S. would stop Indian raids, Native American raids into northern Mexico, particularly the Comanche. We couldn't do that. So when we bought the Gadsden territory, we had a clause saying, oh, by the way, we're not going to stop Indian raids anymore. So we couldn't do it, we weren't doing it, and now we just passed a clause in another agreement with Mexico saying, we're just fundamentally giving up on that goal. Now another aspect goes wrong for Pierce. You have the Austin Manifesto. This wasn't Pierce himself, but some of the people in his cabinet and some other prominent Southerners got together and said, okay, we need more slave states in the United States, so let's find a prepackaged, ready-to-go slave state. And their eyes fall on Cuba. So they see Cuba. Cuba has slavery. It's long belonged to Spain for 300 plus years. And if we can take Cuba, either buy it or take it by force from Spain, that'll be a big, powerful slave state. We might even need to be able to cut it in half and divide it into 2 slave states. Now, Pierce isn't supporting this, isn't promoting this, but nonetheless, it's attached to Pierce because some of his cabinet members sign on to this idea. It's never official government policy, but people start thinking, oh, it's another slave power conspiracy. First the railroads, now taking of Cuba with this Austin Manifesto. All of this is making Pierce look like he's supporting the South and is starting to grow these divisions between North and South. Now, other less divisive things, but are going to lead to further issues during the Civil War, is you have some new Navy ships being built, like the USS Merrimack, that is built during Pierce's term. Now, what's interesting about the Merrimack is the Merrimack will, during the Civil War, be converted into the CSS Virginia. This is the Confederate ironclad. It's going to be a bit of a problem for the Union Navy. So we're already seeing kind of the foundations of what's going to start bubbling up during the Civil War arising in the years prior. You can kind of see the Virginia in the water. We'll talk more about this and read about it when we get to the Civil War. So the Battle of Hampton Roads and the 2 big ironclads on each side duking it out. Now, another aspect going on during Pierce is probably, in my opinion, one of the most interesting. This is Commodore Matthew C. Perry. He's tasked with taking our brand new fleet of ships on a world tour. In particular, we're going one place, a place that no one else in the world has really been able to truly open up, but we think, cocky American attitudes, that we'll get in and open it up, no problem. So we're going to feudal Japan. Now, Japan at this point in time is run by a shogunate, so it has an emperor, but he's more of a figurehead at this point in Japanese history. The true ruler is the military leader, the shogun. And he's kind of the highest of warlords in the land. And these warlords vie for power and control, and the shogun kind of controls it. So when we arrive, we're trying to, so I'll talk a little more about the feudal system for a second. So European feudal system, you see the Pope or church top, then the monarch, and then nobles, knights, all that stuff down. The Japanese feudal system, although the emperor was at the top, he was more of a spiritual or religious head rather than a true governmental lead. The shogun was truly the head. And you have daimyo, who are kind of regional leaders, and samurai, ronin, peasants, artisans, and merchants down at the bottom. Now, Japan at this point was extremely isolationist. They had no desire to trade with the outside world, and they had done so, kind of maintained their isolation very well. When the Mongols had tried to invade multiple times, their fleets had been hit by massive storms, but the Japanese called Kamakaze, or divine wind. We'll hear about this term again when we get to World War II with the sacrificial dive bombers that the Japanese use. So these divine winds helped keep Japan kind of isolated. Now, Japanese islands did have one kind of small island that was open to foreigners called Dejima Island. Now, it's primarily the Dutch that are allowed to trade here in any kind of real capacity. And this is where the Japanese will get most of their firearms. Because you got to understand, we think of the samurai age in Japan as, all swords and arrows. But they really also trained with simple firearms as well. That was one of the tools they knew how to use. It just wasn't widespread. It wasn't made available in large numbers until after the US arrived. Now, we kind of bully our way in. We basically show up with our ships, say we want to trade. Japan says, no, we're not doing that. Then we fire our new cannons on our brand new big Navy ships off to the side and say, hey, look how big our cannons are. They're like, ooh, maybe we should talk to you. So they kind of let us in. We make some trade agreements, and we're going to open up Japan to the West. And Japan is going to embrace it with surprising willingness and speed. It's going to change Japanese history forever. Because we showed up at this particular moment, Japan is going to take a very different path than it might have taken otherwise. This is going to spark the Meiji Restoration. where the emperor and many of his advisors see this as an opportunity to overthrow the shogun and the samurai class. Keep in mind, samurai was the powerhouse of the time in Japan. They were the military kind of elite forces. If you didn't control a lot of samurai, you couldn't win a battle, much less a war. But now, with the US access, plus French and British and German access, guns are now flowing freely. To learn how to use a katana or a Japanese longbow, it might take years of training to be really proficient and successful in battle. To use a gun in a semi-successful way, maybe a few days, a few months, and you can probably point a gun at somebody and shoot at them. So this is giving the the emperor, the ability to train vast masses of peasants in combat, give them guns, give them artillery, and actually have a chance of facing off and subjugating and disbanding these warlords and their samurai forces. So you have a major cultural shift beginning in Japan, going away from the samurai and kind of the feudal system and turning into a more traditional system. So you kind of see these two worlds existing at the same time, the old world and the new, kind of the traditional samurai methods and ways, along with modern kind of Western interpretations. And Japan is going to embrace this. Eventually, the emperor maintains complete control, although he'll lose some of that by the time we get to World War II. But Japan is going to modernize, start building modern ships, and adapt into modern production methods very quickly. So much so that they very quickly become the primary power in all of Asia. So much so that in 1905, they face off against Russia and win resounding victories over the Russian Navy. Then, in 1940s, they bomb the United States at Pearl Harbor. So we opened them up in the 1800s. And by the mid-1900s, they are attacking the United States, trying to expand even further. But we're jumping ahead right now, and we'll come back to them in the second half of U.S. history, talking about Pearl Harbor. Now, one last little thing we need to talk about is the Utah War. So we talked about during the Mexican-American War how we promised not to attack Mormons anymore in exchange for them to serve in the U.S. Army during the war. Well, issues bubbled up again. Conflicts arose, particularly between Protestant Christians and the Mormons, particularly the Mormon kind of tradition of polygamy or multiple wives really irked many Protestants. And we see conflict arise again. And this is going to be a problem. So in Utah, we see fighting break out over the issue of popular sovereignty, whether they can choose to have slavery or not in their state, but they also want to choose other things like polygamy within their state. So slavery, polygamy, and the problem is the Mormons are in the continental United States. Aside from the U.S. Army, the Mormons are probably the second most heavily armed force there. So it is a scary proposition to have such a heavily armed militia, this paramilitary force, kind of operating outside of the purview of the U.S. military. So, and it goes bad. The Mormons lose several hundred people in kind of forced deportation, and it doesn't go well. The fighting isn't too bad, but you have a lot of harsh treatment of Mormons. You kind of see more pictures of this kind of forced evacuation. Now, the last big thing that begins under Pierce's term is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, but we'll talk a little bit more about that and the ramifications of that in our next lecture. But we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with the other major events and kind of this descent into madness in the 1850s.